LAFCO meeting to order, and if you'll all join me in the Pledge of Allegiance, please. Ready to begin? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. We'll start with the introduction of commissioners. That'll be you, Mr. Berryhill.
I can state my name.
Name and
Bill Berryhill. Did I pass?
not quite.
Public member.
Public member.
There you go.
There we are.
Tom Dunlop, city member.
Jim DeMartini, county member.
Terry Withrow, county member.
Amy Bublak, city member.
Brad Hahn, alternate public member.
Sarah Lytle-Penny, executive officer.
Javier Camarena, assistant executive officer.
Rob Terrell, LAFCO counsel.
Jennifer Goss, commission clerk.
Excellent. All right, we will start now with the public comment period. This is time which, if there's an item not on the agenda already that you wish to speak to, fill out a card or come up. Just don't trip everybody. Are there any cards?
You got one?
Oh, I didn't see this. All right, Jeannie, please.
I guess this is sort of on the agenda. I'm here because of the workshop, but I'd like to thank all of you for serving our community and welcome Commissioner Berryhill. Thank you. So I'm Ginny Ferrari, and I'm a resident of Turlock and a founding board member of the Farmland Working Group. Thank you for the opportunity to speak. I understand the extremely important role that LAFCOs perform in the 58 counties in California. From its inception, 2 of the key assignments of the statewide commission were to protect farmland and open space while promoting orderly and efficient growth. As one of the nation's leading ag counties, it seems reasonable that Stanislaus LAFCO would commit to the long-term protection of our high-quality farmland. If not now, when? Major food-producing counties in this part of the Great Central Valley have preserved thousands of acres of farmland. San Joaquin County has conservation easements on 2,200 acres. Merced County has nearly 11,000 acres preserved. Yolo County has preserved 16,000 acres. That figure doesn't include grazing land or open space. There are impressive farmland preservation numbers from many counties in Northern California. Those counties are committed to smart growth and economic development as well. As we know, Los Angeles County was our nation's most productive agricultural county for most of the 1950s. It will never be a leading agricultural county again. Once the farmland is paved over, the scale tips very quickly, and the region loses important support industries that are essential in maintaining a major food-producing area. And we know that the middle third of the nation, as well as the entire eastern portion of the United States, will never produce the agricultural bounty that the Central Valley of California produces. This region is a resource that cannot be duplicated anywhere in the world. I encourage you as commissioners to protect our important agricultural lands for future generations. Currently, Stanislaus County has 300 acres of farmland protected. 300 acres are covered with conservation easements. That land has been preserved through the efforts of the Central Valley Farmland Trust, a land trust that works with counties and landowners to protect farmland in perpetuity. There are other tools. Stanislaus LAFCO has an agricultural preservation policy. I encourage this commission to use mitigation as a tool to preserve our important agricultural lands. I encourage each of you to consider the food-producing capacity of land, including the important soils, when considering annexation. I encourage you to work with Central Valley Farmland Trust. And I ask that you recognize the resource we have and not let it go the way of Los Angeles County. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else wishing to speak for public? All right, I'll close public comment and move to the approval of minutes. Anybody have opportunity to read it? A motion?
Make a motion to approve minutes.
We have a motion? Motion and a second. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Anybody against? Passes unanimous. Correspondence?
You have one piece of informational correspondence related to the upcoming LAFCO conference, and we'll chat about that a little later.
Okay, thank you. Declarations of conflicts and disqualifications. Looking left and right. Sounds like we're good. Good to go. On to our workshop.
So welcome to our LAFCO 101. It's been a while since we've done one of these, but we tend to try to do them at least once every 5 years or so when we get new commissioners, and also just based on interest from the public. Staff will be providing the 101 tonight, and we'll give you a little bit of LAFCO's history, its purpose and power, as well as an overview of some of our local policies and the emerging trends. This presentation is intended to benefit those who are new to LAFCO, but also serves as a refresher for those who are already a little bit familiar with LAFCO. So what is LAFCO? If this was a two-slide presentation, we would just very simply say it's a boundary commission. Unfortunately, we got stuck with a longer acronym that doesn't fully describe what we do and often leaves people confused. So LAFCO is, in its formal name, the Local Agency Formation Commission. And if you were to Google it, you would come up with a couple of other LAFCOs that exist and were formed after us. One of them is a candle company, and one is the Los Angeles Film Co-op. But we like to think that we were the first, and we're proud of our acronym, as confusing as it is. So I'm going to explain to you, this is going to be the short definition. If you were asked on the street what a LAFCO was, and you said, well, it's the Boundary Commission for the county, that would probably be good enough. But here's the longer definition. So LAFCOs are a local decision-making body tasked with approving boundaries of cities and special districts within the county, and also overseeing the services they provide. LAFCOs are intended to curb urban sprawl, encourage logical growth, ensure efficient services, and preserve agricultural and open space lands. One of the tools that we're given in order to accomplish this is the adoption of a sphere of influence or long-term growth boundary for each agency. So in order to understand why LAFCOs exist and why they've been tasked with what they do, we need to travel back in time a little bit. Prior to LAFCO's existence, the state legislature had the sole authority to create and change jurisdictional boundaries of cities and special districts, and that's been in place since California since 1850. There was very limited criteria for annexing. The most notable was that the area had to at least be contiguous to or touching the existing city limits. So a city would adopt a resolution declaring that they wanted to annex property. As long as the property owners were in favor and as long as it was contiguous to the existing city limits, it was pretty much done. And this gives you an idea, going back by the early 1920s, Stanislaus County had 9 of its cities already incorporated by 1922. The 2 that are missing from this list, Waterford and Houston, would later be incorporated in the 1960s and 70s. Each of these cities, of course, has its own unique history for its establishment, and there's certainly some common themes here, like high-quality farmland surrounding them, irrigation districts being in the area and having formed in the early 1900s, some of the first actual irrigation districts in our state, and also the proximity to train routes through the county. So what's interesting about this time period is that the cities would actually, and towns and the counties, would engage in nationwide marketing with newspaper ads and articles encouraging people to move to that city or town. So these are a couple examples of clippings from the early 1900s, something that maybe you don't see as much of today, that are intended to attract increased populations to the Central Valley. In this particular example, Modesto is highlighted, and it's saying, home seekers, come to Modesto. And there's a quote on here, Modesto is highlighted as the finest dairy country in California, where the land owns the water. Another little tagline on there says, come where the water is unlimited and the opportunities for farming, business, or investment are unsurpassed. Stanislaus County at that time also advertised its county as a whole, sending a train car out nationwide with examples of things grown in the county. So we're going to jump ahead a little bit, actually a few decades, after World War II and the population boom. This is a newspaper clipping from the early 1960s. It says, "What has 343 sides and stretches 53 miles around?" And that little subtitle up there says, "The irregular picture of urban growth." So this isn't an ink blot necessarily, but it's actually one of the cities back in the early 1960s. I don't know if you recognize it. Anybody, can you name that city?
Modesto.
Oh, I knew you were going to be able to get it. It's Modesto, and you might be able to see it better on your handout, but the tell on it for being Modesto is you can see on the southern half, which is probably blocked for you guys, it's the airport that was annexed with a tiny little strip, thus meeting the criteria so that it's connected to the city limits. And then also the sewer treatment plant at the time, which is also connected by a small strip of land that goes along the river. There's Modesto is the answer. The story reads in part, "Cities cannot grow in nice, even segments for the simple reason that some property owners do not want to be in the city. So a city must reach out with weird tentacles or thin lines to reach the land of those who want services and are willing to be annexed." And problems that were identified during this time included confusion over service areas, tax rate areas, and election precincts. So the complaints continue, and this is actually another mystery ink blot. I don't know if anyone up there recognizes it, but this is another city in 1963 or 64. Anybody know what it is? Amy should know what it is.
Turlock?
It's Turlock. So, in this, really good. The tell on this one is the top here is Stan State. So what happened was, in order to annex college, they had to take little pieces to get up there, but they made their way up there so that it was actually considered connected to Turlock. The article has a creative way of describing it. It says that Turlock, a turkey center, looks vaguely like an impressionistic bird with a long neck. It acquired its neck and head when the Stanislaus State College campus at top was annexed. The article then goes on to describe nightmare annexations, stating in summary, "Perhaps the new local agency formation commission will undertake this responsibility. The state legislature set up LAFCOs in all counties for the express purpose of putting some limits on the wild patterns of expansion engaged in by cities and special districts." So indeed, this was an issue recognized by the legislature as occurring throughout the state, not just in Stanislaus County. In 1958, former Governor Brown created a Commission on Metropolitan Area Problems. That very well could have been our name. Be glad that it's not. We don't want to be the problem commission. He tasked the commission with drafting a report and recommendations on California's urban growth and issues related to sprawling population and inefficient services. So this is a graphic from the finished version of the study published in 1960. It predicted a nightmare of numbers in California, forecasting a doubling in California's population concentrated in urban areas, including, they've got Modesto named on there. The forecast was a little off, as now it predicted in 1980 we'd be 30 million. Currently we're 39.5 million. Stanislaus County's population in 1960 was about 157,000, and it's now over 3 times that, at 500,000 or so. The report also identified issues with what they called fragmented actions, recognizing that it was not just cities that were sprawling, but new special districts that were popping up. They were creating layers of different service providers in sometimes illogical ways, with no actual oversight or coordination for how they were being established and how they were growing. So special districts are another layer of local government, essentially. They're typically intended to provide a specialized service to meet demands in an unincorporated area. We have about 74 of them. Most are independent, meaning that they have their own board, their own governance structure, their own budget. Everybody in this room probably lives in at least a handful, if not more, special districts, and you tend to not notice until you go to vote and you notice that you're voting for a board member on a district that you didn't realize that was in your area, or you look at your tax bill and you realize that you're paying an assessment towards either, say, a mosquito district or cemetery district or something that you maybe didn't realize was there. There's another fun graphic from the report. They were identifying haphazard jurisdictional boundaries. This one's a little bit more colorful than the ones you saw before. They're calling this jigsaw governments, and this is actually not too far off. It's not an exaggeration. This doesn't represent anything in Stanislaus County necessarily, but it closely resembles when you look at an annexation pattern, or could easily represent a city boundary versus that of a fire district or sewer district. At the end of the report, they had 3 recommendations. Improve present laws concerning incorporation, annexation, and special districts. Enact legislation enabling the formation of metropolitan area multi-purpose districts, not sure what those are, with planning functions. And establish a state metropolitan area commission. So I'll tell you that really only one of those recommendations went through, and that ended up creating LAFCOs. So the creation of LAFCOs in 1963 was actually a compromise of the recommendations in that report. Instead of creating a new state agency that would oversee all those boundaries, they decided to create essentially an agency in each county, independent agency, that would oversee them in order to ensure that we still had local control over those decisions. And that was truly the emphasis of the legislation. So LAFCOs would now be tasked with overseeing and preventing the problems that they identified, jigsaw governments, fragmented actions, and it resulted in legislation that we now call the Cortese-Knox-Hertzberg Act, which has been changed over the years. That's its most current evolution of the act, named after the authors that were involved. So who is LAFCO? The legislature created LAFCO and intended it to be a local decision-making body, so it is actually made up of local representatives. Our commission has 2 county members. They're appointed by the Board of Supervisors, 2 city members appointed by the City Selection Committee, and then 1 public member. There's also an alternate seated for each. So at any given time, we have 5 voting members with 3 alternates. So if any of those voting members has to step aside or is absent, the alternate for that category can jump in and vote in their place. Some LAFCOs in the state also have a special district member. Ours does not yet, although legislation is moving in that direction. LAFCO also has a staff, which was introduced to you at the beginning of the meeting. Commission's an independent body, so they make provisions for their own staff, including an executive officer, assistant executive officer, commission clerk, and legal counsel. Staff prepares the reports for the commission, makes recommendations, interprets our policies and our requirements, and helps navigate the often evolving laws regarding LAFCOs. LAFCO is also funded by allocations from the 9 cities and the county. As set forth in the legislature, these are the official purposes of the commission. And they're as follows: discouraging urban sprawl, preserving open space and prime ag lands, encouraging efficient provision of services, and encouraging the orderly formation of local agencies. And as I kind of said before, the legislature also emphasized that this would be based on local conditions and circumstances. And with that, they have actually tasked each LAFCO with adopting their own policies to carry out the law to reflect local circumstances. So early on in the presentation, I kind of mentioned that if you wanted a quick definition of LAFCO, you would just call it the Boundary Commission and leave it at that. We do have a multitude of powers that go just beyond, simple annexations, which are what we're known for. This is a partial list, actually, of the powers that the commission has, including city and special district annexations, formations of new special districts, incorporations of new cities, which is a rare one, mergers, consolidations, detachments. So you can create something, you can merge it. We also actually have the power to dissolve special districts and cities, which is another rare one, but it happens. Establishing and modifying spheres of influence, and extensions of service outside a city or district's boundaries. So we have a giant list of powers, but I also want to point out that there's things that LAFCOs do not have authority over. So the first is the county boundary as a whole. And that's another rare occurrence, but it does happen when counties want to shift a boundary between each other. That's a state action, and LAFCO is not involved. School district boundaries, if you're familiar with planning, you know that school districts operate under their own set of rules, and placement of schools and school boundaries are under a completely separate section of law and do not go through LAFCO. Certain types of financing districts, Melrose districts are probably the most well-known, landscape and lighting districts, things like that that are typically already in the boundary of a city or a district, those also don't go through LAFCO. Other like board divisions, like a board of supervisors division or city council districts, internal divisions like that also don't require LAFCO approval. And then probably the more complicated one down there is development standards and zoning do not require LAFCO approval. And I say that in the sense that LAFCOs cannot directly regulate land use. So in as much as annexations have an indirect effect over land use, certainly, in development, LAFCOs are tasked with looking at the big picture, and the local land use authorities retain jurisdiction over the detailed planning standards and zoning. So now with that, I'm going to turn it over to Javi, and he's going to tell you a little bit more about one of LAFCO's tools, which is spheres of influence.
Thank you. So, as Sarah said, sphere of influence is a very important tool that LAFCO uses in order to help us preserve agriculture and deter urban sprawl. The definition of a sphere of influence is defined as a plan for the probable physical boundaries of, probable physical boundaries and service area of a local agency as determined by the Commission. And Stanislaus LAFCO's policies and procedures go a little bit further in identifying a sphere of influence as the area around a local agency within which territory is eligible for annexation and the extension of urban services within a 20-year period. So you can see on the slide, it's a pretty good graphic. You have the example of the city that's incorporated, and that sphere of influence line around that is what's considered the 20-year growth boundary line. And that's just a generic graphic, but it displays that pretty good. Stanislaus LAFCO policies also identify what's called a primary area. This area is within the sphere of influence and is intended to show the direction of more near-term growth within the next 10 years. So you see that area shaded within there, that's the primary area. That's the area you'll see that's more likely to become part of that local agency in the near future. The Cortese-Knox-Hertzberg Act requires that a sphere of influence be reviewed and updated every 5 years. Within every sphere of influence update, the Commission is required to conduct a municipal service review. The review serves as an analysis of the services within a designated area. We bring these to the Commission at almost every meeting. There's a number of districts which we'll list out in a later slide, but it's something we conduct at almost every meeting because there's so many of them. And as part of that analysis, a service review must have written determinations that address the following factors, which are on the next slide. So with municipal service reviews, the Commission is required to make specific determinations. Those include determinations related to growth and population projections, location and characteristics of disadvantaged unincorporated communities, present and planned capacity of public facilities and adequacy of public services, the financial ability of an agency to provide services, status of and opportunities for shared facilities, accountability for community service needs, and any other matter that may be related to effective and efficient service delivery. Similarly, when we conduct a sphere of influence update, determinations are also required by LAFCO to be made, and they're very similar to these determinations. So We typically do those at the same time. And this slide just shows all the special districts we have in this county. As you can see, we have quite a number of them. We have some, for example, our Newman Drainage District, which is only one drainage district in the county, up to the 22 CSAs for the county and 14 fire protection districts. So for each of these districts, we conduct a sphere of influence update every 5 years, which is required along with the municipal service review. So that's basically all right now for spheres of influence. I'm going to turn it over to Rob Taro.
There's a lot more than 5 irrigation districts in this county.
Yeah,
I mean, I have like 6 or 7.
West Side, yeah.
the other ones you're probably thinking of fall under the category of water districts. So in total, there's probably 12 irrigation and water districts. But yeah, your side, I think, has the majority of them.
Porto, West Side, yeah.
Yeah.
And there's smaller ones too. I know there's a lot more than 5. Regular meetings, you know, I think, there's a lot of.
Rob Terrell's going to speak a little bit about some of the legal policies and aspects of LAFCO. So,
And thank you. Thank you. And we've got a little law here tonight. And, you know, Madam Chair, going forward, we might want to think about a new policy rather than provide the attorney with an open mic. But I've tried to scale this down. I've got about 3 hours worth of material here. But I'll probably save some of that for LAFCO.
5 minutes.
5 minutes. Well, I was going to say I'll save some of that for LAFCO 201 or 301 then. But there are certain legal aspects, of course, to LAFCO. Some of these are probably more familiar than others with the items that have come before you before. Overall, broadly, the Brown Act is applicable, as is the Political Reform Act, Sequa, and the Public Records Act. And of course, one of the ways we see the Political Reform Act, the commissioners all fill out a 700 form. But in addition to that, there are all the other requirements as well of that provision. The next slide, of course, very familiar, is that Sequa applies to LAFCO as well. Now, typically, the items that have come before you, we rely on someone else's work, but LAFCO is a responsible agency within the meaning of the law, so it's certainly applicable in all regards to what comes before LAFCO. But one of the other areas that may not be as familiar to what we've seen here is the Public Records Act in California. And so the statute that governs that is Government Code Section 6250 and et cetera going forward. But of particular note here is Section 6252, paragraph E, which defines public records. And you'll note it defines public records very broadly. And you know, I'm not going to just read this to you. But really the key words here, in my opinion, are that it refers to any writing that's used or retained by a local agency. And so that's us here at LAFCO. And then this actually goes on to define writings, and that's cut and paste right from the statute, what the legislature intended. And you see it's a very broad, very encompassing definition of what writings are. And really, I think the key words here are and especially not just the letter of the law, but the spirit and the essence of it, is that every other means of recording and any forms of communication or representation. All right, so that's, and we're in an electronic age. And so that applies to everything, any type of medium we use, emails, text messages, such going forward, fax, everything, any of these can be deemed to be public writings and public records accordingly. Now, there are a lot of exemptions to the Public Record Act. I think the last time I checked, there's approximately 24 different exemptions, but the basic idea of the Public Records Law in California is for transparency and is for openness, is for the people's business to be done in public, right? And for us here in LAFCO, you know, that it also dovetails nicely with the Brown Act. We have public meetings, we have hearings, we have speakers and such. So that's probably not a big surprise, although we don't have a lot of contact with that statute. And then, LAFCOs get sued, right? We've had a little bit of that here, not necessarily my tenure. I think wrapped one up just when I started in 2014. But by and large, sort of painting with very broad brush strokes, is that the courts support LAFCOs and their findings, right? And we heard about it with how it's originated in the Cartesi-Knox-Herzberg Act. You're involved here in a pursuit of an overriding state purpose. And so the law is really designed to help keep those favorable decisions in that light. One of the things you do, of course, when you have something is you have determinations versus findings. And what that really means, the best way to satisfy that is to marshal your facts and evidence towards the findings, right? We're talking really about best practices to avoid any type of legal entanglements going forward. So if you marshal the facts and evidence toward the findings and make those findings amongst the other good practices, we follow the correct procedures, and we do that with our agendas, our notice, again, with our hearings, an opportunity for people to be heard. We don't want to appear biased or prejudiced, and we want to have everyone have an opportunity to be heard and avoid conflicts of interest. Some of the other items I touched on are some of the common ways that LAFCOs get sued for Sequa, for fair political practices, and even sometimes the Brown Act. There's certain, legal theories I won't really get into here, just based on the statute itself. But by and large, those are where they come from. And really, the idea here, and we've touched on it tonight, is the idea from the legislature is that, right, LAFCO, the commissioners in LAFCO, you're in a leadership role in our community. And the legislature has understood that, and they've given you even further powers in your leadership role, because they want you to have the power in the community. You know what's best for the people who live and work in this community, and make those decisions with that in mind. And so really, again, that's what LAFCO is about. And this last bullet point is one of my favorite parts about a LAFCO case. That's an esoteric area for the lawyers to talk about. But in a published case that a judge wrote, that LAFCO is actually the watchdog for the legislature. Obviously meaning local control at the local level, but it's really the legislature's watchdog to make sure that what's best for the people who live and work in our community are represented by you. And so there's sort of a blueprint, another statute here. This is Government Code Section 56325.1. And this refers to, this is the commissioner's duties for all of you, regardless of how you got here or where your appointing authority was from. And this is really the legislature's direction and mandate to the commissioners. And so another thing that lawyers do all the time is we get asked, well, what does this mean? What does this mean? And we wring our hands and gnash our teeth and try and decide what things mean. And really, it's pretty basic. And at the basic low level, it's the idea of statutory interpretation and statutory construction is that when the legislature gives us these words, the legislature, and we have some experience here, they meant what they said, and they said what they meant, right? And so when we look at this is what they're telling us to do, telling the commissioners to do. So while serving on the commission, all commission members shall exercise their independent judgment. So that's an important word for us lawyers to wring our hands over, because when it says shall, that's a mandatory duty, right? So that's something the legislature is telling you, you will do this. So you shall exercise independent judgment on behalf of the interests of residents, property owners, and the public as a whole, right? So not just your appointing authority. And it's important to note here in this statute that they did that again. They used the word shall again, and again, the public as a whole, and not just the interests of the appointing authority. And so that's really, as I stated, that's really what, as far as legally, what LAFCO is about, is that the idea of the decisions that are made, you marshal your evidence and facts towards those findings, and you make those decisions for what's best on a whole, or for the whole, the public as a whole, for the people in our community. And so I guess I'll save the other 2 hours and 55 minutes for LAFCO 201.
Thank you. And just as a clarification, you talked about the electronic age. Commissioner DeMartini's not there yet, so we'll work through that part.
It makes my job that much easier.
Right?
Thank you.
So any questions of staff thus far before we open it to the public?
Not sure that we're done. I'm not sure, we have a few more slides.
Oh, I'm
Madam
sorry.
Chair. That's
Oh,
okay.
awesome. There's more.
There's more.
Okay.
So really quickly, I do want to give you kind of an overview of what a standard annexation process is, mainly because of the end of it and the confusion that can result. This is a really simplified annexation process. Typically, they're initiated by either petition of the residents or property owners or a resolution of application from the actual agency. We tend to see them from the agency because the agency usually has already done some work as lead agency for Sequa or for the project itself. Staff then goes ahead and reviews the application for consistency with the policies and state law. There's a public hearing where folks can comment on it, including affected agencies, and the commission can then either approve, modify, or deny the proposal. In most cases, there is a protest hearing that comes after the commission's decision of approval. And that protest hearing is held by staff, the property owners, and registered voters in the area have the opportunity at that point to come out and protest if they disagree with the commission's decision. And that can actually lead to a possible election, or if there's a majority protest, that can actually terminate an annexation. After the result of the protest hearing or the election, if it triggers that, staff then either records a certificate of completion that would make the annexation official or terminates the proposal. So I wanted to point that out. That does come up. Commission does have the final say, but in certain circumstances where you have an inhabited area, the people in that area can actually come out and protest and overturn the commission's decision. For the commission's review, this list has grown over the years, but there are several factors that the commission has to consider. And if you're familiar at all with planning and Sequa, a lot of these overlap, but they're specifically called out for LAFCO to review and make findings on. And they include what you see on your screen there: population and growth, the ability of the agency to actually provide the services, effect on ag lands, availability of water, which in more recent times is even more important to look at, logical boundaries, landowner and agency comments, and even more, effects on adjacent areas, the consistency with the agency's general plan, land uses in the area, financial plans, and then conformity with LAFCO's own policies. So I wanted to highlight one of our local policies you may have heard of that was adopted by the Commission in 2012 after about 2 years or so of going through different drafts and discussions and comments. It requires a plan for ag preservation to be prepared and submitted with each application that affects agriculture. And that plan must specify the method or strategy to minimize the loss of ag lands. The Commission chose a menu in their policy, and that menu approach allows for an individual agency to come in with their own adopted policy and compare it and see if it meets some of the things that the Commission encourages as methods and strategies to protect ag land. So if you look at the policy, it's still linked, I think, from the homepage of our website. You'll see a menu there that shows things that are commonly heard of, like one-to-one. It actually kind of quotes the county's policy. It also allows for things like an urban growth boundary. Other options include in lieu fees or a redirection of growth, showing that you're directing growth away from prime ag land. So I would encourage you, if you haven't already looked at that policy, to take a look at it. I know, especially after it was adopted, a lot of articles and things that were written on it immediately called it a one-to-one ag strategy, and this is we're going to require one-to-one on everything. But you really do need to look at the menu that's offered there and sort of the flexibility that it allowed, which was meant as a compromise, especially for those cities that were already looking at adopting their own policies. Other local policies that we have, of course, give guidance for logical boundaries. We do have some policies that basically encourage a city to improve its existing boundary if they've already got islands and illogical areas, to try to improve that and not make it worse. There's policies that give preference for infill and compact growth patterns, as well as policies that give priorities for provision of services. the priorities for services there refers to not necessarily creating a new entity or a new district every time you propose a development, but looking at annexing it to an existing district or merging two districts that exist to try to have a better efficiency and less proliferation of those multiple agencies we talked about. Some of the emerging trends, one of these Javi mentioned that has come up are disadvantaged unincorporated communities. And this is a requirement that came about for cities and counties as well as LAFCO. We're required to identify disadvantaged communities with all of our municipal service reviews and our proposals. We're also required to identify if there are deficiencies with fire, water, and sewer in those areas. An additional provision that applies to LAFCOs requires that if you have an application that is annexing an area next to or that includes a portion of a disadvantaged community, that you need to include the entire community or at least attempt to include that entire community in the annexation. I mentioned this, I think, back in January when we did a presentation on islands. This commission traditionally sees chip-away annexations in areas like that, including islands, that where they're taking a block, but maybe they're not taking the entire area because it's not feasible for whatever reason. Usually it's lack of infrastructure. And this new provision requiring that an application include an entire duck has actually discouraged some applications from coming in and doing that chip-away approach. Another emerging trend that we're seeing is more involvement with the special districts. Certainly this commission has directed staff to consider impacts to districts, and particularly fire districts, with annexations to cities. We're also seeing proposed legislation that would ease the process to include districts on the commission. That's moving forward, and we'll probably see that effective next year. It's going to require LAFCOs to call together all the districts for their own, basically their own kind of voting commission, and that would typically be the way that districts would seat themselves on LAFCO. This trend I've mentioned before too is a trend towards out-of-boundary service extensions, and a lot of that was as a result of when we were having the drought and failing wells. Cities and districts have to obtain LAFCO approval prior to extending a service outside their boundaries anyway. And one of the exceptions is for situations like health and safety, where it's considered, maybe a more feasible alternative than annexing an entire area. You can just solve the problem of the one failing well rather than encouraging development in a whole area by annexing it. Looking ahead to LAFCO's future, as I mentioned, recent legislation has actually, for the most part, increased LAFCO's powers, especially in regards to LAFCO-initiated actions. For the most part, LAFCOs are generally responsive to things that are occurring. Somebody brings us an application and we process it. We do municipal service reviews, but they tend to be more informational and not really action-oriented. There's been some recent legislation that allows us to initiate our own applications for things at this point, such as dissolution of a district. If you had an inactive district and there was no one else who would logically bring the application to us, we can actually initiate that. There's some legislation looking at trying to increase sort of the recommendation power of municipal service reviews, although at this point we don't know where that's going to go. There are some exceptions to, as I was saying, the legislation increasing our powers in certain areas. They're sort of bypassing LAFCO processes, and one of those has to do with water. Recently, we had some legislation passed that would basically force a water system consolidation, something that would normally start and end in the LAFCO process, is something now that the state can actually do and force a LAFCO to process the paperwork for, but not really have any discretion over. And that's just based on the state's goals right now for clean water for everyone, including disadvantaged communities, and they're seeing that as the most streamlined way to accomplish it versus going through the LAFCO process and risk, a denial by LAFCO, essentially. So that's all I had without going too much into a LAFCO 201. I included our contact information for the folks in the audience. If you got a handout, you can certainly contact us by any means listed there. There's also some excellent resources linked from our website to our state association, LAFCO. They've got some great documents talking about various topics of interest. And you can certainly contact us by email, too, if you have any comments or questions on this presentation. That's all.
Okay. Now, are there any questions of staff? Go ahead.
I have one quick question. Seeing us as an administrative body to a great degree, if I was a city and I follow all the rules on an annexation and farmland preservation and everything, I came before this body and was denied, is there, I mean, where is that line between us making a decision on the law being followed and just an arbitrary decision, no?
I think there's certainly, when you read through the factors, there's a lot of open areas there where the commission has to use its discretion. And there's some wording in there where, you know, they'll say, is this a substantial amount of growth, or is this going to have a significant effect? And those are things that the commission has the ability to look at and say, well, as a commission, we think this is an excessive amount of growth, and you haven't shown us why you need it. You've walked through the steps, and we're going to suggest that you modify it and shrink it down a little bit. There are things in there that allow the commission to, I guess, have the discretion beyond just an administrative action. And I think the legislature kind of wants the commission to actually walk through all of those factors and think about them rather than just say, well, you've done the plan and we're good with it.
That was my question, because as you read through the documentation, there's these gray, I guess best to call them gray areas that leave the group to some discretion whether, even though you did everything as a city. And someone asked me, as a constituent asked me, well, if cities are competing against an industrial project that needed an annexation, what's to prevent this body from saying no to Modesto and then saying for the same development, the same stipulations in Oakdale? And who's the final arbiter if something like that would happen? I don't know if that's ever happened in the past, but I understand what they're saying. Because we all compete nowadays for the tax base, right? We all compete for some way to have more money to pay PERS, for example.
Wow. Okay. You want to take a shot at that, Mr. Legal
I think
Man?
that's fine. And just
good with that?
add, we're quasi-legislative here, and there are limited areas of appeal, but otherwise, I think Sarah's answer is perfect.
And I think there's a great slide during your talk, Rob, back there when I talked about what the legislation asked us to do, is asked of this commission and the discretion that we have, and to look at take our hats off as county supervisors or city council members, and look at the whole,
Right.
As compared to our individual interests, and this commission hopefully has that ability to do that.
Right.
And it's
Exercise the
tasked
judgment.
with that, right.
Yeah, exercise judgment towards the public as a whole, and how you decide that.
Right, but if someone deems that unfair,
Well, then they can explore their remedies.
so there is still remedies after that, theoretically.
There are some. Yeah, theoretically, hypothetically, there are some remedies, yes.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions before we open it up to public? All right.
I just
I'm
wanted to
sorry.
ask a question. That you said that the state is going to be more efficient than the local on the water thing.
Oh,
I'm just joking.
meant-
I've never known the state to be more efficient.
They're attempting to make the process a little more streamlined where they bypass LAFCO. How about that?
Okay.
Might not be more efficient, but they're trying to
Streamline.
go
No pun
around
intended. Yeah.
the existing process.
Okay, I'm going to open up to the public. Anybody wishing to make a statement, ask a question, clarification, please come up. This is the time. Nobody? Okay, I'll close the public hearing, bring it back to everyone. Where are we at? Any other questions or comments?
I appreciate that we put Brad that far away from the rest of us.
Right.
In the meeting. Thanks for doing that, yeah.
I was outside all afternoon, so I understand.
It's time for comments.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I just wanted to welcome Commissioner Barry Hill as the newest member of LAFCO. He's got a great deal of experience in government, almost too much.
Close.
Came from the swamp in Sacramento. Anyway, welcome to LAFCO.
Thank you, Jim.
Great. Well, I too want to thank everyone for putting this workshop together and for people coming to observe and figure out what we're doing. It's always a good refresher as well. And I'm sure that if there are questions arise after you leave, feel free to contact. They gave you all the information, and we'll be able to figure that out for you. Then we'll move on to commissioners' comments. Anybody?
That was my comment.
I would just say it's a pleasure to, I appreciate the Commission's support and really look forward to serving the county and serving. I think this is going to be a fascinating, certainly a learning experience for a while, and very much look forward to it. I think to be part of shaping our county's future and how we preserve ag land and where we preserve it, and that is it's going to be a really neat experience, and I just appreciate your guys' support. Thanks.
Okay. Then we'll move on to additional matters at the discretion of the chairperson, and I have none. So, executive officers report.
So we just received information today about LAFCO's annual conference, and we typically plan for 2 of our commissioners to attend. So if you are interested in attending, let us know. I think Commissioner Diamartini is probably interested. It's October 25th through 27th. And we'll end up emailing you out further information on it. Staff is recommending cancellation of our July meeting as there are no paid applications that are currently scheduled for the date. So our next meeting would be August 23rd, 2017. And that's all I have.
Okay. Then I need to entertain a motion here. A second for closing this meeting up. Adjournment. Anybody?
Make a motion to.
Got a motion? A second? Second. All right. All in favor of adjourning? Say aye.
All right.
All right. Thank you, everybody.
Can't